Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And we are celebrating our 400th episode.
Can you believe it? As ENPs in the Myers-Briggs system, talking about personality type, we know that this is probably I think it's a pretty big feat for us to do every single week for 400 episodes in a row. I'm impressed, I just have to say, with myself. I want to give myself a big pat on the back and you a pat on the back too.
Let's do some self-back patting, shall we?
I mean, it's not easy to do this, man, especially with when you don't have a natural wiring to do something on a routine like this. It's hard. It's really hard for us to continue going, and I commend us for making it happen.
Yeah, who said that ENPs can't stick with something?
That's right.
Who said that? Certainly not anybody who's watched us do 400 episodes.
It was the internet. The internet
told us that we couldn't. So I think actually, just to reflect back to that, because 400 episodes, and by the way, that doesn't include our PHQs, right?
That's right. This is just 400 of the main episodes.
Right, because when we were doing PHQs a while back, I think that there was probably, I don't know how many PHQs there was, but there had to have been a couple dozen at least.
Yeah.
So that's just the weekly podcast. And I think that represents, we started in January of 2014, so that represents 6-7+ years.
I think we're in the middle of year 8, or we're starting on year 8 soon.
Yeah, all 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 2020. Yeah, we're well into year 8. Mm-hmm. So that's something.
Does it feel like 8 years we've been doing this?
No.
It feels like maybe 2 or 3 to me.
Yeah, but I don't really have a concept of time. So whoever said that ENPs can't stick with something, they were wrong. Whoever said that ENPs don't have a concept of time, they were right. I think that's the challenge, is that when you have introverted sensing or memory as an inferior 3-year-old function, it's hard to track what's happened over the years. Everything feels like a brand new, every day you wake up, it feels like a brand new world just got birthed in front of you, and now you're walking in it. So to track changes over time and to track, basically any sort of timeline is challenging. And I think that's one of the reasons why, having done this for so long, yes, we're taking a moment out to pat ourselves on the back. We've done very good. Good job.
I think we've earned it a little bit.
That's right. So there is a little bit of that going on. But I think the other piece, and this is something that you really have put me onto, Joel, is this idea of legacy. And having done this for 8+ years, it means that we time-bound ourselves and the things we were talking about and where we were at, what was interesting to us, what we were growing through. We time-bound that into these little audio recordings that we can chart. Like we're using technology to make up for some of our deficiencies, our inability to ourselves track those changes over time. Now technology has time-bound those things, and we can go back and spot check. Like, I go back to the very first year of our podcast, and I listen to it, and I'm like, wow, we've really grown.
Some of it's cringy just hearing yourself back, and some of the ways you think about stuff, and then you always look back at your past and go, wow, I'm almost embarrassed that that's how I thought about something, or that's how I was seeing the world now with my new understanding.
Well, and also just our delivery. I go back to the very beginning. There was a time period, I don't know if you know this, Joel, but there was a time period where I used to take over the podcast and do a lot of talking.
I don't even know what to say about that.
And it was very aggressive about it. I remember us being on somebody else's podcast a long time ago, way back in the early days. I listened back and oh my gosh, I'm the verbal, energetic equivalent to a steamroller. I just took over the conversation and just steamrolled it. And they were so kind about it. In fact, I even sent an email later that I was like, I listened back to that podcast and I'm sorry that I was such a steamroller, because I was so used to doing all the talking. That's how I had been raised to do public speaking, is basically, especially if I didn't have a script. If it was an outline, and if it was emergent, I just did all the talking. And I like to believe that after that had been pointed out quite a few times, that while I still do probably more than my fair share of talking, I think the energy of the steamroller has, let's hope it's been throttled a little bit. Fingers crossed. But you can really hear that steamroller energy in early days. And so I feel like, at least for myself, I feel like I've grown as a podcaster, not just in content and not just in my life cycle, but also as this as an art.
As an ENFP, I have this experience of surprising myself with my own wisdom. Like, I'll listen back to episodes from years ago and hear myself give advice or talk about something, and I'll go, I forgot about that inside myself. I forgot I have that tool or that resource or that perspective. I'm always wanting to grow and change and learn, and so I'm always looking to the new and the novel. That's how I'm wired as an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, right? And also, there's wisdom that I've culled from myself that I listen back to, and I'll do this with old journals, things I've written. I'll be like, oh, that's actually pretty smart. That advice I gave there for I almost apply it to myself and go, that's really good advice. I appreciate that aspect of this almost audio journal that we have here, where we're able to see some of the things we've been talking about over the years, depending on whatever energies we've been attuned to, whatever personal growth projects we've been on, because we're not always in the same energy field of that. We change and we grow as people. And so sometimes we have advice from ourselves that comes up for us. And if we're able to capture that, or those thoughts or those perspectives, we can capture those and review them later. There is so much remembered wisdom that we have inside ourselves that we can use going forward. So I've appreciated this also, not just in the cringy parts of like, oh, I wish I'd said that different. I feel embarrassed how I was articulating something, or I've refined my thinking around something. I think it's more sophisticated now. There's other moments where I'm surprised by just how sophisticated some of the thinking was from myself to myself. I'm looking at my thoughts and going, wow, that's good stuff. I want to apply that now in my life.
Definitely. And I have thought about this multiple times, maybe in a less self-flattering way. I'm not that I'm saying that you're doing it in a self-flattering way. I think that is legitimate. And I think remembering that we have had wisdom recorded it's a part of, I suspect, what encourages us to keep going is that when we listen back on some podcasts, we're like, okay, I'm not just saying, bullshit here. There might be a legitimate reason why I've set myself up in front of a microphone and sent it out as a message in a bottle to the universe. And also, it's not just that the past me had wisdom. It's that sometimes I feel like, okay, this is going to get self-flattering, but sometimes I feel like I'm channeling information from the universe, almost like the collective unconscious. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. I feel like my extroverted intuition function can sometimes tap into it and start channeling patterns that live in that cloud, right? Whatever that cloud is. And so it's not that I had that wisdom, it's that I had access to that wisdom for a moment.
Absolutely.
Right. And so then when it was time bound, it sounds like I'm saying, at least to me, again, self-flattering, it sounds like I'm saying smart stuff, but I think I just have access to smart stuff in that moment. And I'm so glad that it was captured. I'm so glad that it was put down on record somewhere, because I don't once I stop channeling, it feels like I lost access to that piece of information. So having it be, having it be on record is really good for me.
Yeah.
Because then I can hear myself say that thing and it has even more power. I'm like, maybe I should apply that too. Maybe I should be doing that as well.
There's a notion in Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich, about thoughts as things. Like almost they're real, they're tangible. I've even heard stories of people closing the door in the room that they're trying to do brainstorming in so the thoughts don't escape, almost in this weird abstract way. And it's that idea of channeling. I think if you're a writer or a creator or anybody that has to output creativity or art or thought into the world, there's this idea of a muse that shows up to help you do that creative endeavor. And I think the idea of the muse is there's some other aspect of creativity joining you in that moment to speak through you in a way, to have a voice that's beyond just what your individual capabilities are. These thoughts, they're almost out there and we tap into them. They don't necessarily emerge from us. They emerge through us in a way, I think is what you're saying, Antonia. And I don't think that's just unique to maybe a podcaster or somebody like you that's quote unquote channeling. I think a lot of people that are in the creative space end up doing this. And I think even in the business world, whether it's super creative in how we think about it, artists, writers, creators in that way, I'm sure business people, like someone trying to create a business strategy, all of a sudden has this idea, this intuition, there's something that strikes them. They're almost channeling it, or maybe a social cause. There's almost like this moment of history that strikes someone for a certain social movement or something. So I think we're all tapped into some of these energies, and we're channeling, which really on our 400th podcast, and we've actually recorded one for the 100th, the 200th, the 300th, and this is our 400th. We kind of make a point to sit down and record it and talk a little bit about where we've come from, where we're going, and that idea of channeling and tapping into energies really leads us to what we're attuned to right now, Antonia. And going forward, we are starting to attune our energies to more Jungian concepts around archetypical energy. And it's almost like that concept of channeling. It's almost like you're tapping into an energy of an archetype beyond functions, beyond your personality type. There's something else at play. And Carl Jung talked a lot about this in his writings. In fact, the Myers-Briggs system is based on one chapter in one book of all the collected writings of Carl Jung, right? And we've hyper-focused on that as typology enthusiasts, but there is so much more that Carl Jung talked about. In fact, recently we just created a program with Dr. Dario Nardi called Jung on Yoga to tap into some of the yoga practices, chakra, kundalini awakenings that Jung had in India, and then also teaching it after he had gone on these journeys where Jung had brought this information back to the West and had presented it. And so we have a new course that doesn't just talk about the theory of that, but also talks about the body-mind practices. And Dario even leads us through specific yoga practices. You can watch the video and actually model what he's doing to tap into some of these energies. So I think this is where we're heading more and more. We understand that, especially with Beatrice and Aranio and the Enneagram, that we're doing more work with them. We're understanding just how much of a psycho-spiritual tool the Enneagram is. And we're a little envious at first. Like, oh, we wish Myers-Briggs was a psycho-spiritual tool like the Enneagram. And then we start to read Jung and look at more Jung's work and go, actually, it is. Like, there's a lot of elements here. We can tap into these archetypes and how they show up for us. This is a powerful framework to start to understand. Now, it's nuanced and can be challenging at times, but there is a lot of power and growth opportunities thinking in terms of these archetypes.
Absolutely. These 100th episodes tend to be they're very self-focused. They're like, okay, what's going on for me right now? And so we give ourselves a lot of permission to be very self-focused on these. And so I'm glad, though, because every 100th episode, we get to track where we're at as well. Like in a very, in early days, it was like, what was Personality Hacker all about? And where do we see ourselves going? But I think right now, like you mentioned, I can feel, probably because of maybe where I've been in the last couple of years. We recorded some podcasts on Dark Nights of the Soul and some of the bigger challenges experienced over the last over the last year or so. And also looking at world events and some of the challenges that the world is experiencing. And there's lots of different systems and lenses to diagnose what's going on in the world right now. Potentially, generational theory is very insightful about what's happening right now. You can see a lot of people's shadows showing up right now. People are behaving from their shadow because it's hard for people to look directly at it. And so there's a lot of different ways to sort of shake it out and go, okay, this is what's happening in the world. But whenever I see world events, I know that everything that I don't like about what's happening out there is a reflection back of something that I'm not happy is happening in me. And so I feel like my journey very much has matched the feeling of the outside world. Now, this might be because of some of the functions I'm using. I use extroverted feeling as a tertiary or 10-year-old function. And so this function makes me tap into the collective in some ways where I'm sensitive to the energies of the collective. And it may be that my journey matches society's or the global journey because I'm wired to do that. And in some ways, I'm very grateful. I'm grateful I went through this dark night of the soul. I'm grateful I have had to contend and wrestle with some of the darker aspects of who I am. because it required me to tap into, as you mentioned, this idea of archetypes in a way that I had only conceptually understood them before. Like I've read Jung's works. I've read, like you were very kind to purchase me the Red Book for my birthday one year. And so I've had access to some of the really, really esoteric stuff. And, his collected works and his work on archetypes and his work on psychological types and all that stuff. But nothing has really helped me understand the depth of what is actually being addressed since I've had to go through my own, I would call it a psycho-spiritual crisis. And it feels like that old adage that when the student is ready, the teacher will come. Well, oftentimes the teacher's been around for a long time anyway. Like Jung wasn't missing during all, before, but now my relationship with his work is evolving based on me getting maybe closer to, in resonance to some of the challenges that Jung himself experienced and some of the ways that he led himself out of those dark places. And so now his work is talking to me in a way that it didn't before. Before it was very thinker, very abstract, very conceptual, very thought-based. It's not that for me anymore. And as you mentioned, we would make statements in the past that we had envy that Enneagram was a psycho-spiritual tool. And now that I'm revisiting Jung's works and not seeing them just like, don't have one-sidedness. Well, does that mean that I just have, that I have to make sure I have introverted sensing along with my extroverted intuition and that avoids one-sidedness? It's so much more than that. It's so much more. And now I'm experiencing it. It's an embodied knowledge, right? It goes from data and information. One of my favorite models is DIKW, data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And by the time you get to knowledge and wisdom, it becomes an embodied knowing. It goes beyond just data and information. And before, Jung was very data information for me, or maybe I would say information. Now it feels like my relationship to a lot of this stuff is going into a knowledge and wisdom place, which is deeply exciting. And also, I don't know, it's a new place. It's new territory, and it's not easy. It's exciting, but not easy.
Getting your head around some of this stuff can be challenging. I think I also have learned, as what I consider we're influencers in this space. We have a podcast, we have a voice, we have an audience. You're listening to us right now. I've realized that presenting things and offering them is probably the way to go, not to try to push understandings onto people. I think as we talk about archetypes and psycho-spiritual practices, one of the things that I think in terms of is I wasn't really ready for it many years ago. I had, at the moment in time, I had to find an exit or a transcendence of my traditional faith background and framework I came from. And in doing that, I had to almost shut the psycho-spiritual part of me off a little bit just to get some separation. And I don't think I could have heard messages. If somebody was trying to really talk to me about, you got to get into archetypes and really find the spiritual, psycho-spiritual tools in Jung's work and typology, I probably would have resisted that a lot because I wasn't in a place where that was, the timing was off, right? It's timeline conversation. It wasn't that it's not appropriate for my life. It's that at the time I was working on something else, or I needed to create separation. But I think that separation has been fully realized. And I think I've gotten to a place where I feel good about where I've come from. I've integrated the parts that I used to have into my life that I think are still useful. I've transcended the other parts. I didn't want to reject them, but I wanted to transcend them in a way that I don't reject them, meaning I don't burn bridges around it. I want to have options to pull these. What if in the future something I reject I need? I don't want to do that. I don't want to make it severe. I don't want to make it a cutting process. And that's me personally. But now that these archetypes are coming up, and they're coming up in a real way, energy work is something else that also, I think these archetypes and energy, staying in high vibration energy, seeking opportunities to avoid low vibration energy. I always had this idealism that I could go into those places and influence that for the better. And I realized that every time I get close to a low vibration energy space, negativity and low vibration energy, the chaos that comes with that, the undermining energy, the breaking down, the destruction, I'm not really that strong to pull anything out of that. I just get sucked into it. And so I've just learned the only real strategy to deal with that kind of thing is to avoid it, is to find ways around going there. And I think some of the archetypes and archetypes inside of a personality framework, like Dr. John Beebe, who we've done a lot of coaching with personally, you and I, Antonia, we were working with him. He has a model of archetypal or archetypical energy inside of our psyche, ourselves that comes up. And just outside of type and functions, cognitive functions, just seeing how those archetypes show up to me. It's almost like they're awakened in me at different moments in my life. Man, this has been some powerful stuff. It probably fails when I try to put it into language because it's so experiential. It's such a visceral, experiential place I'm coming from. But I can say that this has been impactful on levels that I've never realized in any other system that I've utilized.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell says that the most interesting conversation is conversation around things that are languageless. And so we don't talk about them because we can't. And so unfortunately, at a certain place, words break down, but we still try. And he said the second most interesting conversation is trying to put those things into language. And so this is us trying to do that and generally failing, but we'll see.
Well, and I was thinking about this earlier. I was doing dishes earlier today, and I was actually thinking a lot about this because we were preparing to record this, and I thought about experience. And this makes sense why we are so keen on creating experiences going forward. At Personality Hacker, we're looking to create live events, live experiences where people can come together in real time, because there is something about the energy, almost archetypically, if you get people into a room, into a space, and you create the proper energy, you create the proper platform, and you create the proper environment, it's almost as if certain energies can be awakened in people. That sounds so abstract and esoteric, but it can only happen through experience. So our goal, I think, is to see ways we can try to create those experiences for almost like a garden that things can grow inside of.
Yeah, I think it was the last 100th podcast anniversary, maybe 300th. I don't know. It was one of those. And I could be wrong, but I think we talked about our intent to do more live events, and we've done that. Over the last few years, we've been creating more and more live events, and we've observed that happen. You create a certain platform and container, and now some of these energies are archetypal energies that live inside of us just need somebody to push a button oftentimes. And the more familiar we become with these energies, and by energies, we mean like it's almost like a mythological place inside of us. It's a script being just ready to be, to take off. And when we get around certain people, certain energies, and even the biggest skeptic around all of this will know, well, when I'm around certain people, they bring out the best in me. And when I'm around other people, they bring out the worst in me. All that person is talking about is that different archetypal energies but those buttons are being pushed, and the scripts are running themselves out. They're just playing out in a way that doesn't feel like you have much control over it in the moment, until in retrospect you go, that person brought out the best in me, quote unquote, or that person brought out the worst in me. They may have just been bringing out one of these energies, and you create certain contexts, certain containers and platforms. And if you curate it well, you can bring out the kinds of archetypal energies that people long for, to see themselves play out this way and get a taste of it. Then it becomes a souvenir. Oh, I know what that energy feels like. I know who I was in that space. Now I can bring some of that, the souvenir of the feeling of what that felt like, and I can start implementing it in my day-to-day life.
I think an example of this is we age. We go through different archetypical energies. At my age, I am a father. I have a family. I've got children. And I've, at the time of this recording, 2 teenage boys, 15 and 13, and a 9-year-old daughter. And I'm in the midst of being around teenage boys that are in the midst of puberty, in the midst of awakening to their mature selves. They're transitioning from childhood to adulthood. And there's an archetypical energy that comes online at this time period in a young person's life. My daughter's a little before that, right? She's coming up on that very soon, but my 2 sons are in the midst of it. And I'm not in that energy right now. In my life, I'm in more of a midlife energy. I'm in the archetype of responsibility and provision and
fathering.
Yeah, I'm in a father kind of archetype. I'm not really in that young man coming online archetypical energy.
Or sun energy.
Or sun energy, exactly. And so I see this, but I can relate because I have been there in the past. And so when I'm around them, I try to access what that is like again. I try to remember, oh, that's what it was like when I was in that place in my life. I need to remember that as I talk to them. They're in a different place than I'm. If I try to talk to them and transmit father information in a fathering way, I need to contextualize it for them as my sons. I need to contextualize it, make it applicable to what they're going through specifically. They don't have the energies I have right now in my life, and I need to be able to tap into where I came from so I can help them and guide them as their father. So this is something that can kind of give you a sense of a little bit of what this might look like. As you go through life, we have these different energies that turn on and off throughout our experience. When we have a child, that mother and father energy kicks up. It almost awakens the archetype in us, and we can see a shift. We show up differently to the world now that we have a child. And you might have gone through this experience. You were one way, you had a child, and you're like, wow, it's different. Life is different now. I've got different priorities. I've got different things I'm looking at. You're still the same person, you're the same personality type, but you've embodied a different kind of archetype, a different kind of energy. And I'm expecting as I get older, when I'm a grandfather someday in my 70s and 80s, maybe 90s, if I'm fortunate enough and blessed enough to live that long, I'll be tapped into other energies. I'll be tapped into maybe the old wise energy, the sage, someone that has a whole different set of wisdom that I can bring to the table. And I think that these things are at play all the time in our lives, whether we're aware of them or not. These things come up for us. And this is some of what Jung was talking about. We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
It's not just that they come up for us, it's that they're all living inside simultaneously, waiting to be expressed.
Good point.
And expressing in ways that we might not be aware of. And living underneath this idea of archetypes, and the reason why archetypes are so powerful is that they're once again, they're effectively, they occupy a similar position as personality types do. Mm-hmm. Personality types are intended to be a finger pointing at the moon. There's like that old axiom in spiritual circles, my finger's not the moon, right? It's like, don't get, the finger is pointing to the moon. You're supposed to be looking at the moon. Don't get too fascinated by the finger because the finger is just trying to point to the moon. Or Robert Anton Wilson's statement, the map is not the territory. Or no, that was Alfred Korzybski. The map is not the territory, meaning that don't get too enamored of the map because the map is just meant to help you understand what you're actually exploring, which is, the terrain around you. And archetypes occupy a similar concept of personality types, but personality types feel a little, they're somewhere between, like this woo-woo archetypal energy understanding and hardcore science that only likes the big five, right? like there's these two sort of nodal places where people want things to be like either 100% rational and explainable, or they're willing to open themselves up to this concept of like energies and energies within us. And personality types are this place where people find sort of a middle ground between the two. But personality types are a finger pointing at the moon. And we have a tendency to get really fascinated by the finger. Or they're a map for the territory, but we start obsessing about the map. And that's something that typology has a tendency to do when we understand how powerful it can be. We become enamored with the power of it, really. And we start to think of it as something that can explain everything. I think that the value in understanding archetypes, which for Jung lived under all of this, like there were a lot of different things that he brought in to his understanding of what were effectively archetypes of cognition. That's the cognitive functions. And unknown to most people, he also brought in other things like an understanding of chakras that he got from his trip to India. And he brought in understandings about mythology, and he brought in awarenesses around the unconscious. He brought in the archetypes of how we experience ourselves. And all of these created a bedrock for what has been birthed, right? The child of all of this is personality type. And personality type, anybody who's into type knows how powerful it is. Well, the source material is what we're talking about right now. The source material are the archetypes, which are less comfortable places to look for the same kind of concept. It's less comfortable because it's a little more abstract. It's a little harder to put into language. It's a little more experiential, but that's what makes it closer to a psycho-spiritual tool. Aranio Paez, who is one of our Enneagram partners, has this great statement. He says that when it comes to psycho-spiritual work, you always need more than one tool for growth. Always. So you can't ever use just one tool for growth. Personality type becomes a fantastic on-ramp for a lot of people for growth and development. But it can't be the only tool you're using, because if it is, well, then a couple different things can manifest. First, you can become so enamored of the tool that you forget that it's just a means to an end. You can become merged with the tool. There's this phrase in psychology called role-person merger, which is when your identity starts to become merged with your job, basically your career or whatever role you see yourself in. But I think that you can also a person can do tool-person merger, where our identity becomes completely wrapped up in a single tool or framework. And it's basically the same idea, only it's less a sort of an extroverted way of merging with something that lives outside of yourself. And it's more of an introverted way, like it's a framework within your mind, but you've become merged with it. And diving into the murky underbelly of all of this, like you said, it's one chapter and one book of all of Jung's works, right? Chapter 10 of Psychological Types. Getting into the context that surrounded all of it and what Jung was working on expands the tool set, even if it's in the same general genre or idea. It's an expansion of tool sets. And going back to archetypes allows us to do a couple things. Now, the first one is it allows us to, on some level, make peace with this idea of a shadow. So Jung talked about different aspects of who we are to ourselves, our relationship to ourselves. We have the ego, which is the I statements, who I am, and who you see me as is our persona. It's a extroversion of our ego. It's the image we cast for other people to reflect back to us what our ego wants to believe about itself. So the persona it's not quite a mask. It's more the war paint we put on, right? It's like when I put on makeup, I'm not changing how I look. I'm just enhancing it so that it has a better, it has a little bit easier time of navigating through life, and it gets a better reflection back to the self. So the persona is more like makeup than it is a total mask for most people. Sometimes it is a complete and total mask, but those people are usually very fractioned. They're the self is very divided, usually when that's a complete mask. That's usually more of like an enhancement. But that ego is the I part. And then there's another part of us called the shadow. And there's, I think in modern spiritual or maybe even therapeutic ideas, I've gotten this sense that people believe that the shadow is where our trauma lives, right? Our shadow is the part of us that's hurt. But I think it's even more difficult to make peace with than that. The shadow is not a place where our trauma lives. The shadow is the part of us that causes trauma. It's the worst parts of us. The shadow is the part that offends our values and virtues, the ones that live in the ego. And so it becomes very difficult to look at directly. It becomes very challenging to create a relationship with and even be willing to acknowledge that it exists at all. But in order to get to what Jung called the self, so the self is, for lack of better words, the person God intended us to be. It's a whole self. Dario Nardi, another one of our partners, Dr. Dario Nardi, calls it wholeness with joy. When we expand and stretch into this bigger concept of self, we get to explore all the territory within, everything that makes up who we are meant to be. The challenge is that there's all these parts of ourselves that need to be integrated in order to explore that territory. Because if we don't integrate these parts, the lack of integration is oftentimes a lack of even acknowledging those parts exist. Once we acknowledge they exist and look directly at them, then it's our responsibility to start integrating them. And that's the best, most healthy relationship we can have. So when we look at the shadow and it's filled with ick, right? Ugh, that's not me, we like to say, but it is me. It's totally me. It's the worst part of me. It's the part of me. Well, okay, is it the worst? Yes, it's the worst part, but it exists for a reason. I'll just say that. But if we can look directly at the shadow and recognize, yeah, that's me too, we don't expend energy on turning away from it. Every time our shadow comes up, if we won't look at it directly and recognize that it's us, then we spend all this time and effort avoiding looking at it. And a couple different things emerges from that behavior. The first one is that the ego and the shadow oftentimes get locked in a battle. Like they're in a civil war with each other, and it's all happening unconsciously. They go to war because there's no relationship there. There's no simpatico. There's no like, yes, I know that you're part of me, and I'm going to do what I need to do to set up a council so that all of these parts get a voice, right? Even if it's not best friends, a buddy to buddy, at least it's a truce. And acknowledging the shadow, it gives you the ability to even start that process to happen. It qualifies you to even begin that. But the other thing that happens when we ignore the shadow is that in the effort to constantly avert our gaze away from it, there's all this territory inside of ourselves that also gets ignored and neglected because we can't look at anything the shadow would even be next to. So there's a bunch of terrain, internal terrain, that we never explore. There's there's large parts of the self that ends up being, in video games, they'll have these maps in front of you as you're running through a territory. And as you explore that portion of the territory, the map starts to fill out. Otherwise, it'll be represented in like grid marks or whatever. And when we avoid the shadow, when we avoid these parts of ourselves that are very unflattering, well, there's lots of grid patterns inside of ourselves. There's tons of areas of the map that go unexplored. And these archetypal energies describe some of these best and worst parts of us. And if we can say, you know what, everybody has these archetypal energies inside of them. Everybody has these positive and these negative ones. And we talked a little bit about, we did an entire podcast on John Beebe's 8-function model, which discussed all these archetypes. But if we can acknowledge and recognize that everybody has all of this inside of us, or inside of themselves as well as us, then it's like, okay, I'm just being human, right? So the humility, the humanness and the humility of going, I'm a human like everybody else. I'm going to have both these good and these bad. It allows us to look at our shadow and recognize it and see it directly without having the dialogue of, I must be the worst person alive. Nobody else has all these terrible parts. It's just me. I must be such an awful person, and I have to hide this from everybody else, and so therefore I'm going to hide it from myself first. It doesn't have to bring all of that script in there. It doesn't have to bring all of that baggage in there, because the shadow it's inside of everyone. And then when you look at it directly, and these archetypes help us understand, put language to how they show up. And then when you add the cognitive functions, it adds yet another layer of how they show up. Now it's like it's a way of making peace, so that the ego and the shadow themselves together can create a relationship that allows us to start exploring the self, this wholeness with joy.
In the last year or so, you have most likely had the experience of chaos and disruption and trauma on a global scale. In the year 2020, We all went through a global pandemic together. The COVID-19 virus hit on the global stage, and we all had to deal with it. And I think what really came to light during that is the fact that we have a spiritual bankruptcy on this planet. Many people have suppressed the shadow Antonia is talking about, or found escape routes. I think one of the selling and marketing points, marketing is somewhat of what we do here at Personality Hacker. We create programs, we have to market them and make them palatable for someone to invest in themselves and grow. And so we understand how marketing principles work. And if you look at the marketing from cults, and I don't just mean cults like the ones you'd think of as a cult, but a lot of social movements are cult-like in their marketing and the way they operate, in that the group you join has the answers for you. I think the marketing there is, hey, if you join this movement, this religion, this cult, whatever it is, we will allow you to not have to look at and or address the shadow. In fact, we're going to show you how you don't have to look at that. You can project that onto that other cult across the river or this other people group. You can project it onto them, and all the shadow work you have, we can go ahead and project it collectively, and that will absolve us from having to work at it. And in fact, built into the system is forgiveness, or not even forgiveness, just absolution from any of the shadow stuff that might come up from us. We're not responsible. In fact, it's that other group over there. And you can see this everywhere you turn today. I don't care what your political, spiritual, social, it doesn't matter the wiring. We all are caught up in this dynamic on the global stage. And what I think the shadow work and archetypes allow us to do is to repersonalize this for ourselves. Get out of the cultish thinking of, oh, I can join this group and they'll make me not have to look at this. In fact, they'll help me make it somebody else's problem. And it brings it back to self to go, oh, this is something I'm going to have to see inside myself. And you can almost see on a collective way the whole world is dealing with shadow material. And we're not very equipped for it. I think religion has attempted in the past to try to get to this. But again, even religion has that whole, you get absolved of this and you can project it outward, whether it's like Satan or demons or other people or sinful nature or whatever in religious circles. In Buddhism, it would be desire. And I don't exactly know what Hinduism, I don't know a lot about the Hindu religion or Islam, but I know that there's these outward focused ways of absolving that shadow work. And so I think this is going to take some bravery. And the messages that we're hearing, the marketing messages we're hearing everywhere is don't do that. It's not about you and fixing this inside yourself or working on the shadow material. Just join our group and we'll help you feel good about this. And in fact, we'll show you how to project this outward and you don't have to worry about this at all. And I don't think that's helping us. I think this is only exacerbating the problem, making it worse. And a quick look in the mirror, I think that is really needed to see, okay, where am I showing up with some of these archetype energies, this shadow material? What's driving me from the darkness, from the shadow within me? What's influencing my decisions? And where am I projecting this outward onto other people, making it their problem, when really this is something I need to own and look at for myself?
I do think that religions of the past have attempted to address at least the feelings that having a shadow element of us bring up, like guilt and shame and a need for, repentance and redemption. I think there is definitely, there's been attempts made, and in all sorts of spiritual elements, there have been attempts made. The challenge is that making peace with the shadow isn't seeing it and then never visiting it, rejecting it, looking for something that's a propitiatory sacrifice over over the evils of the shadow. And one of the challenges that a lot of religions have made is this idea that you have to be sinless. You have to be without sin before God. That's a very Christian way of saying it, but there has been a lot of this idea of purity, and that you have to be as children and innocent in front of God. Shadow work means, it doesn't mean that you look at the shadow, acknowledge that's in you, and then reject it. Shadow work is acknowledging it exists inside of you and it's there for a reason, and you need to integrate it into your identity in some way. So part of shadow work, and you might want to reference back to the 8-function model podcast that we did as a reference point to all of this. But if you look at some of those shadow archetypes, there's things in there like the Senex Witch, which is the shadow version of the parent energy that lives in our ego. In Myers-Briggs cognitive function terms, this would be your auxiliary function. Your second function is the parent. But that 6th function is not the 6th function itself, but the position, the archetypal position that falls there is the Senex or Witch. It shows up when it believes a boundary has been crossed. It shows up harshly, oftentimes with a withering authority in order to make it so that other people don't lean too much on you. There's a reason that archetypal energy exists inside of us. When we overreach, when we do too much for other people and we start to feel our boundaries being, stamped on or whatever, stomped on, then this is the archetypal energy that is designed to show up and keep us from having those boundaries crossed. So it exists for a reason, but you don't want to constantly and perpetually be banging everybody else over the head because you feel like your boundaries were crossed. That's not appropriate either. So each one of these archetypal energies does something like that. It doesn't see the world or the self in idealistic terms. It sees the world in more realistic and sometimes cynical terms. And there's a place for cynicism at times in the world that we navigate through. So all of these energies exist to support us and to defend the ego. The challenge is that they almost always are undermining and they overreach. And so if we look at the shadow and go, okay, so I guess integration doesn't mean rejection. It means when one of these archetypal energies is evoked by circumstances in my life, this is how I'm going to generally show up. But instead of reacting and letting us becoming possessed with one of these energies, I'm going to instead understand what that energy's job is, and I'm going to attempt to, in a more mature way, respond to the situation. To use these archetypal energies, not to be used by them. And when we create a schism between our ego and our shadow, when we refuse to look at our shadow, two things happen. I know I mentioned this before, but I'm going to even further elaborate on this. The first one is that when we're in our shadow, we won't acknowledge it, right? That later on we might think in a sort of a self-conscious way, oh, that wasn't me. Like that's not how I usually respond and react. And then we come up with a gajillion different rationalizations for why it was okay for us to do it in that one situation. Well, I was dealing with a narcissist, or that person was really mean to me and awful, or they're the ones that started it, or whatever is the rationalization. So when we become possessed by the shadow, we figure out a way, we squirm our way out of responsibility for having been possessed by it if we won't look at it directly and we won't integrate it. That leaves us ripe for being possessed by it on a regular basis. It means we're either in the ego or we're in the shadow. And when we're in the ego, well, that's because that's us and we're awesome people. And then when we're in the shadow, it's everybody else's fault. It's everybody else's problem because we won't even acknowledge it exists, much less moments in which we were possessed by it. So not having an integration plan for the shadow means that it's going to be pulling our strings like a puppet master in ways that we don't even understand or acknowledge. And it destroys relationships. It's a saboteur. It's undermining energy in our life. And then we don't have a balance for it.
And few people are going to help point it out for you, except to project onto you, because they're dealing with something very similar. And it's almost like a collective codependency. We don't want to call each other on this because we don't want somebody calling us on this. So again, we go back to that marketing tool that the cults or the culture at large gives us is join this group. All of us will protect ourselves against having to see this. In fact, we'll just project it outward collectively. So this is insidious. It's hard to get to because there's so many messages. No one wants to see this. And there's so much help to run in there and cover for you and cover for me. Like everybody wants to help me not have to see it because they don't want to see it for themselves either.
Well, and that's the second thing it does, is when we don't directly acknowledge that these energies are inside of us and we're bringing them to the circumstance or the environment, when we simply cannot see it directly because our ego won't let us, then we start projecting. We project it onto everybody else. You're the one that did this. This is when we were going through some of these energies in an event we did with our Profire training students, we did a 2-day event, and we spent the first day going through all of these archetypal energies, what they mean for us based on personality type. And we were getting to one of the archetypes, which is trickster, and somebody said, well, isn't this just gaslighting? And I'm like, that's a perfect word for it. Some of these archetypal energies are proficient gaslighters. And yet we have a tendency to project the concept of gaslighting onto everybody else. We project a lack of good intent. We project bad faith. We project gaslighting. We project undermining. We project all sorts of things onto people outside of ourselves, never owning that we have those energies and we bring them out all the time. That's the big piece of it, is going, okay, I have to own that I'm a player in all of this. There's a reason these parts of me exist. They are intended to defend the ego when we believe the ego is in trouble. So it exists for a reason, and yet it is a tool that is misused all the time. So we talked about the shadow as being like fluoride. You know, a little goes a long way. You have to have a certain amount of it in order to be healthy. But if you get too much, and it doesn't take much to end up having too much, you can get fluoride poisoning very easily. Once you enter that space, though, it's quite toxic. So fluoride, you need a little of the shadow with you all the time, but too much is toxic and poison. But the worst thing you can do is to allow the ego and the shadow to live separate lives. Joel, you mentioned in Breaking Bad, there's a scene with Jesse Pinkman, who at some point says, what was the line?
By the way, if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, I think this is a great show to illustrate the main characters handing themselves over to their shadow, not integrating it in a healthy way, but just surrendering to it. And the entire story is about a high school chemistry teacher who's diagnosed with cancer. You find this out in the first episode, so I'm not ruining it for you. He finds out he's got cancer, and he's a high school chemistry teacher. He wants to make money for his family before he passes away. So he partners with a former high school student of his that understands the drug trade on the street level. He understands the chemistry. They partner up to start creating meth and selling meth in the Southwest of the United States to make money. And so this character, Jesse Pinkman, is that student who understands the drug trade on the street level, because that's what he used to do when he was in high school. And Walter White is the teacher who he partners with. And so there's this moment, they're going through this experience of cooking meth, distributing meth, ruining people's lives all over the place. There's all this negative stuff that happens.
Ruining their own lives.
And Jesse Pinkman is in rehab in one of the seasons, and he's tapping into himself and understanding what's coming up to the surface. And he basically says, I think I finally know myself. And it looks as if the filmmakers are going to lead us down the road of him having this come to Jesus moment, or reconciling his shadow and integrating it, and then realizing he needs to be better and move forward. And he just goes, I'm the bad guy. And in the scene, he almost surrenders to his shadow. It's a moment in the show you realize, oh, this is a very different show than I was expecting. They're not going to have, quote unquote, a happily ever after ending to this thing. We're not even all the way through it, but I already see where this is headed.
Yeah. Well, and it's actually one of the greatest television shows of all time, in my opinion. And it, unlike many shows, it ends beautifully, right? It ends perfectly.
Satisfactory.
Very satisfying. And also, that scene is so great for illustrating, okay, so you've got the ego and you've got the shadow, and most people reject the shadow. They look at it, and it makes them feel really icky, and then they pretend they didn't see it, and they reject it. Other people observe it, see the shadow, and know that they operate from there so often that they hand themselves over to it. So instead of being in the ego and rejecting the shadow, they simply are in the shadow. That's their primary archetypal energies that they bring to the world. And it's almost like they reject the ego. And that's not healthy either, right? You don't want to be in one or the other, because as long as those two don't have dialogue between each other, you have a civil war happening all the time. There's constant internal battling. I can't remember which Jungian analyst that I was reading. I want to say it was Robert Johnson, or maybe one of the forwards in his books, but he basically said this creates a real philosophical problem for the individual. They've got these schism parts of who they are. It creates a real problem internally. And if you're avoiding the ego, it's the exact same thing as avoiding the shadow. There's all this territory and terrain inside of you that you're just not exploring.
There's another great show that came out on the same network at the same time of Breaking Bad, which is called Mad Men, about the Madison Avenue advertising executives in the 1960s. It takes you from 1960 to 1970 over the course of, I think, 7 seasons. And the main character, Don Draper, actually is also doing shadow work. He has a schism in himself. He's at war with himself, 2 different identities that he brings forward. And the story is different than Breaking Bad. It is the story of how he integrates those together. And I think that's another great showcasing of these energies at play, watching that character go through that integration period over 7 seasons. And I think it also ends very satisfactory at the end of that when he finds a way to combine those energies rather than rejecting them.
Absolutely. So going back to this idea of these archetypal energies, I mean, we've used our 400th podcast episode to talk about them. And I think it's because this is where we're living right now. We're living in this space of archetypes and energies and realizing the roots of all of these personality types, and that it was meant to be a therapeutic tool. That's one of the reasons why if you read the descriptions of the cognitive functions in chapter 10, they're not flattering. These are not flattering descriptions. You read descriptions of cognitive functions in any modern book, including ours, and it's a lot nicer. It's much, much nicer, more fleshed out. Here's the good and the bad. Jung didn't pull any punches. These are considered not to be great necessarily because it was a therapeutic tool. Now, when you get to a place of, leaving one-sidedness, a part of leaving one-sidedness is not just developing the opposing part of the polarity of the cognitive function stack or whatever. It's also not allowing yourself to be purely in your ego or purely in your shadow. It's integrating these parts of yourself. It's integrating the anima or animus energy of the 4th function. That is what John Beebe calls a gateway to the shadow. And why is that? It's because that 4th function is a weakness. When we can integrate that part of ourselves and acknowledge that it's a weakness, we can now humble ourselves enough to go, well, if I can integrate a weakness, maybe I can integrate darkness. Right? Integrate the darker parts of me, the parts of me that feel like they're offending values and virtues. Maybe I can recognize that I have the other side of this. And now through all of this integration, we leave one-sidedness. We leave the part of ourselves that, quite honestly, when I think of one-sidedness and sticking with the ego and rejecting the shadow, that phrase, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? It always feels like that's a choice to be right, at the cost of happiness. So for us right now, we're really looking into this, all of this as a psycho-spiritual tool, as something beyond just a way to understand our wiring and our mental wiring, but as a way to tap into something that, might be one of the purposes of life. I hesitate to say that becoming whole and into the self is the purpose of life for everybody. I think it's probably mine. Right? That might be my purpose of life. And I believe it is one of the purposes of life, is to tap into these ideas of who we are, what elements of and patterns of who we are resonate in a timeless way. These archetypes are found in myths. And hearkening back to John Campbell, he mentioned this idea of myth, or no, maybe once again, this is Robert Johnson. Anyway, the point is that myth has been in modern language co-opted to mean falsehood. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's just a myth. It means it's a falsehood. But when you look at myths, they're actually universal truths. They're the opposite of falsehoods. They're the ways to understand these ideas that live on before and after us. After all the fads of the ideologies of the time period are gone, right? Like after we've argued to death all these points about how we're supposed to be seeing things and how we're supposed to be thinking and all the ideologies that are constantly vying for supremacy and status. After all of that is over and the dust settles, these myths and archetypes lived way before us, and they're going to live way beyond us. And whatever is the fad of the time of how we're supposed to be thinking and all of our isms, they're the ones who live through all of that. They come before and they come after and they live now. So tapping into myths and tapping into archetypes and understanding that these are psycho-spiritual tools are a way to ground ourselves into something that never goes away. These energies never leave us. And we're part of that collective unconscious dance of all of this. We're part of something that whether or not it's God or whether or not it's an emergence or whether or not it's, it doesn't matter the source. It is and has been and will be. And we're part of that dance. And we can see ourselves as a microcosm of all of these different elements and aspects. And it always makes us part of something bigger than ourselves. When we reject the shadow, it's just us out in the cold, right? Alone, constantly avoiding looking at what we are. When we integrate these parts of ourselves and find that full self, now we can tap into the dance of humanity and the choreography that where we belong. This is where I fit in all of this.
We have an assumption that you desire an experience of the wholeness of joy. We have an assumption that you desire to feel balanced and to tap into the energies that are not one-sided. You don't double up on your strengths, and you don't just focus on your weaknesses. You find balance in the paradox, in the tension point. And I think that from a standpoint of what Personality Hacker wants to do is we want to create containers for you and other people that think similar to you to experience the wholeness of joy. I think that's what we're after. And I think that that's where our focus is going to be as we talk about this 400th podcast, where we stand. I think our focus is going to be, how do we create those containers, those platforms, those spaces for people to have an experience of the wholeness of joy? And it might just be a small taste. One of the things that my personal experience with psychedelics gave me are these very short temporal moments, 8 hours, 12 hours, of experiencing another place, other archetypes, tapping into different kinds of energies. I get a taste for what that's like. And it reminds me, there's something else that I can access. And I can also access that through other practices, breath work, attention, slowing my frequencies down. There's other ways to get to those places. And that just gives me a little bit of a glimpse of what's possible in the psychedelic experience. And that's just one technology. And so thinking about that, as we think about these experiences for the wholeness of joy, what tools do we have at our disposal? Well, we've got Jung's archetypes. We zoom in a little bit more, we've got the personality type systems themselves of the Enneagram, we've got Myers-Briggs. These can be real practical tools, starting points for you. Maybe you're not ready yet in your life for deep shadow work, but you're ready to start growing your co-pilot or your auxiliary cognitive function, your personality. That's the first step for you. And these tools can meet you where you're at, which is really exciting. And I think they're infinitely expandable, and there's much more to go down after you get started. You get started on that growth path, you grow your co-pilot, you start to balance your 10-year-old or tertiary process, maybe you start to grow your sixth function, and you start to see these things in growth elements, just as functions themselves in your personality, and you start to see changes in your life. True learning equals behavior change, and you start to change your behaviors. And things start to open up. Your relationships start to improve. Maybe your career path, you choose something that's more ergonomically designed for your life. And now you've got the material elements of your life in place. Your relationships, your career, your personal goals, all this is hooked up. Now maybe it's time to look at some of the shadow work. Now you got everything, working right. It's starting to break it all down again, I guess. But that's really kind of how life is. It's the cyclical nature, these cycles we go through. It's almost a spiral as we grow. And you kind of return home every once in a while, back to where you started, but you're different than when you left. And I think that's really how growth works. And so you start small, you start with what's accessible to you at the next level, right in front of you. That's where you start. And then you start to move through that process, and more opportunities present themselves. When a ship leaves the harbor, it's easier to steer. There's more possibilities for where it can go, which islands and distant lands it can travel to, but it's got to get out of the harbor first. It's got to take that first step in something and start working on movement. And then once it's in motion, then it can be steered and moved much easier once it's out of the harbor into the open waters. And so I think our encouragement to you is start where you're at and be thinking in terms of how you can also access experiences that support you, that give you access to a moment where you get a glimpse of what does wholeness of joy look like for you. Because, what are you waiting for? Your life is going on right now. Like, the play button has been pressed. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is actually happening. Reality is actually unfolding. You and I and Antonia are all three getting older every moment. We are older now than when we started this podcast together, and that's going to continue going forward. And so what are we waiting for? We can't wait for the world to change out there because that's not going to happen in our lifetime. Are we going to really want to get to the end of our lives and go, wow, I really thought the world would change for me to be able to grow and tap into some of this stuff, but I guess that didn't happen. No, we can take control of ourselves now and where we're at in this moment of time. And I think that's our encouragement to you is find the access point now. Don't wait until it's too late or until you have resentment or years have passed by. The play button of your life has been pressed and it is playing currently in front of you.
So, what do you think? You think we'll make it to 500?
I hope so.
That it takes about 2 years.
Roughly
2 years.
52 weeks in a year. We release every week, so just a little less than 2 years.
I don't know, man. We'll see. We'll see if we can get... That's your goal, isn't it? To get to 500.
Minimum. That's my goal.
Minimum.
I love that. I love the idea of the consistency and not having missed a week for this long. It's almost like hard to want to stop at all now. Yeah. You're on this trajectory or something.
Yeah.
It might evolve though in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Into how we produce them, who's on the podcast, who hosts them. Maybe we'll expand the show to include other elements as we go forward. Or I'd love to see secondary, shorter run shows, maybe a second podcast that's more topical in nature that just has 6 to 12 episodes in a season or something would be another idea.
We barely get this one out.
And by the way, Antonia, thank you so much for creating these with me this many years. I appreciate that. I know this is you've shown up with a lot of effort and intention. Your voice is very much represented here, your thoughts, your mindset, all of that. I have personal gratitude for you as a partner, as a life partner and business partner and podcasting partner. Massive gratitude and appreciation for you showing up all these years.
Well, and I mean, I say it all the time. I don't know how I can communicate this more concretely. This would not exist without you. It was your idea to begin with. And my goodness, there have been so many times when I've been like, let's just skip this week. It'll be fun. And you're like, no, we have to get one out every week. And there have been times when we've had to backdate. Right? We've been a little bit late because of life circumstances. And so we haven't always been perfectly consistent every single week. And that's usually my influence that we haven't been perfectly consistent, because if it was up to you, we would be on time every single week for the last 8.5 years. So thank you for being so on that. Because like I said, I get to have a journal. I get to know what I was thinking about and what I was working on right now in the timeline of my history. I get to know that because we just sat down, we recorded it, and I just got to communicate all the things that are, deeply interesting to me and all the things that I'm working on. And in 20, 30 years, I'm going to look back and be like, oh yeah, that was cute. Look at her talking about her shadow. Isn't that adorable? Because I'll be wherever I am then. And so, thank you. I from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this and making this happen for the last 8.5 years.
And thank you for listening. I don't know how long you've been listening. You might have just started. This might be your first episode. God help you. Or you've been here for many years. We have some people who have been with us since the beginning, since January of 2014. They've been listening with us. And if you're one of those folks, if you're that person, we really appreciate you coming and being a part of this every week. And I'd encourage you, introduce us to some people in your life that you think would benefit from personal growth tools, particularly through the lens of personality types like Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram, but we also talk about other tools and systems that tap into your personality, the person that you are, and the opportunities to grow. So we'd love to meet your friends and your family. If you'd introduce us and this podcast to them, I think it'd be really cool because then you have other people you can talk with and share your growth journey with. And they're listening along too, and it gives you a good conversation starter on a weekly basis. I think it's a cool little tool for you.
You think we have people who have been hanging around since January of 2014?
Oh, yeah.
Really? I just always assume we're like a 2-year thing for people.
If you have, you need to make your voice heard. Come over under this podcast and let us know that you've been here since the beginning. You heard, from day one, you've been through the whole thing. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. I don't know. There was not very many people at the very beginning.
I
Maybe.
bet. Well, I mean, this is, I think over time we've probably collected some folks, but there's been a few people I think that are, I don't know.
We'll see.
Regardless, we want to hear from you about this episode. What's been coming up for you as you've been listening along? Have you tapped into and understood archetypical energy in your life? Are you like, Joel and Antonia, you guys are crazy, this is nonsense, or somewhere between those two things? Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Make your voice heard. Let us know what's coming up for you, maybe a comment, a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. We'd love to hear your stories about how these ideas have shown up for you in your life.
And if you enjoyed this podcast and you haven't already subscribed to us, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a ton, especially if you're one of those people from the very beginning. That would be fun if you haven't already done so. And we have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have an entire suite of programs at personalityhacker.com that are personal growth through the lens of personality type. And we've got a lot of great offerings at this time period in history, at this moment in the timeline, this little time capsule. We've got personal growth, of course, but we also now have body, mind practice programs like Jungian Yoga, which we highly recommend. We have the Myers-Briggs starter kits that deep dive into your personality type, and the Enneagram starter kits that are becoming available. And those are fantastic. We partnered with Dr. Beatrice Chestnut and Aranio Paez, and we couldn't be happier with them. And a lot of other offerings. So go check that out. Invest in yourself, invest in us, help us get to the 500th podcast episode, and see if there's a program that's right for you in that catalog.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next 401 podcast. Here at Personality Hacker, we'll talk to you then. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.